turned into fish. So there were lots of fish. But, you know, that older woman said, this is what you have to do. So the chief had the wisdom to listen to both. But then also, what's important is the ice that's melting. So our people know about changes to the earth. Climate change, and I just wanted to kind of set the ground rule, you know, however many minutes in we're into this presentation. But climate change is not a hoax by the Chinese. It's real, and our people have known about it for a long time. Our people know that the earth changes, and there are times that when we have to do things in order to adapt and survive. So this is a part of our traditional knowledge. So for me, there was a beginning of all things, and this is back in 2005 in Hurricane Katrina. So prior to that, I was enrolled in a degree program at Full Sail University in Orlando, working on video game design. In 2004, Central Florida, we were impacted by 4 named storms, just coming straight through the state like that. And it was a bit of a chore to learn video game design and computer science by generator power, basically, and candlelight. So that was one thing. But upon the completion of my program, we're getting close to the end of August, and we see, you know, this big storm. We see the impact. You know, I think at that time it was like a Category 1 going through Miami. And we saw the impact, and immediately I told my family, I was like, you have to get out now. You have to leave New Orleans now. And my mom was like, it's okay, you know, there's the plan, there's the contraflow, which in Louisiana we shut down both of the interstates, and the interstate only goes in one direction. Either everybody's going to Houston in the west, or people are going east. But once you get out of the city, you're just on that direction. So you have to complete the journey. And so my mom did that, and left New Orleans with my grandparents and my uncle and my sister. And I remember one kind of bit from my grandmother. She said that my grandfather at the time, he was very, you know, proud of his house, and he was kind of busying himself polishing the copper doorknobs. And my grandmother was like, what are you doing? We have to go now. And he was like, oh, no, you know. But she says, but no, but you don't understand. We might never come back. And they only did to salvage what was left. Those days stick with me. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, 10 years after the fact, and being here, and people were, you know, it was in the national consciousness again. And I started to get the questions, and I was like, there was only so much that I could take of it, and I had to kind of just check out. But my family made it out, and my mom, when she went back to our house, most of what we had was damaged or mold. But there was a set of stickball rackets that she had up on the wall, and she positioned them in the Choctaw way, which was crossed like that, and the water did not reach those sticks. And so we have a story from NACOP history about the funeral home in Dorchester that burned down, and all that was left was the drum. And so I empathize with the community here in that respect, because whether it's water, whether it's fire, the destruction is there, and your life gets taken away, but you're still, Spirit leaves you one thing. It says this is the path that you have to go. And so my mom took that as a sign, and she went back to, she took my family closer to central Louisiana and our tribal land, the Tunica-Biloxi tribal land in Marksville, Louisiana. And there she followed. My mom is a retired teacher from Orleans, would be Orleans Parish, but then became the state of Louisiana. And prior to getting a job at the school in Marksville, she followed a directive from the Department of Education in Louisiana, saying that report to your local schools, and if there are any students that are there to be taught from New Orleans, that's where you're supposed to go. So she follows the directive. She goes to the local school, and while applying for the job, she was told, "Why don't you get a job at the casino? What are you doing here?" And that set her back. And in this book, Recognition Odysseys, which we worked on with our friend Brian Klopotic, it's called Rich Indian Racism. Basically, you have your casino, you have all this federal money. Why don't you just do, what's the point of you being here? What do you have to contribute to this school? It's basically what they were telling them. On top of that, my family, outside of New Orleans, my family is predominantly black and Indian. And so, they looked at her and they saw her last name, and they could only imagine what her husband looked like until my dad decided, hey, I gotta get active in this community because everybody thinks that, it's our cousin Marshall that's married to my mom or something like that. So it was racism on levels that my mom experienced. And my dad, he didn't go with my family during the evacuation because he worked in public works in St. Tammany Parish, outside of New Orleans, and so he had to stay behind. Thankfully, I was positioned where I was in Central Florida, because my family was able to pass messages back and forth. I'm not really sure about what happens with the cell towers in an emergency situation, but for some reason at that time, my mom could call me, my dad could call me, because my phone was a Florida phone, but they couldn't call each other. And so I had to pass these messages back and forth. My dad is going through this adventure, basically, and not sure if he's going to make it. So I had to kind of, have those awkward times of like, I love you, son, and tell your mom that I love her, and I don't know if I'm gonna. It was a lot to pass those messages back and forth, but everybody made it out safely, and my dad was able to find a job with the tribe, but using his public works experience, and so be able to like work with water, work with wildlife, and everybody basically was fortunate enough. At that time, we were fortunate enough that the tribe had the gaming revenue and other tribal revenue in order to be able to provide for my family. So we were very fortunate in that respect. But, Katrina, hurricanes don't stop because they say, well, hurricane, that was it. That was the best one we could do. Well, they just kept on coming. And, this past year, my community again, we have community members in Houston, Texas, and so there was the time of being impacted by Hurricane Harvey, and the loss of property that my members were experiencing at that point. But at that point, tribal revenue, gaming revenue, wasn't so much a thing, and so it became a personal mission of our tribal council members to provide for the recovery for our members. They set up a GoFundMe page They physically went down to Houston and, you know, in trucks and just got people out of there, you know, with the rising waters. And so it was a harrowing experience for my whole community. But these, it's all, you know, linked, these extreme weather patterns. You know, the offshore development that's happening. I just want to kind of like give you guys like a call to action, kind of break away from my story, but I do want to give you guys a call to action because, you know, in July 2010, the United Home Nation invited several delegates from Ecuador, indigenous activists, to go down and to talk to the tribes that were there that were affected, not by hurricanes this time, but remember in 2010 there was the BP oil spill.
Right.
And so there was the cleanup that was involved with that, and there was the impact to that. And so again, as I said previously, you know, even just the activity of this offshore drilling impacts the coastal erosion that happens. And so, you know, now we have not just because of severe weather patterns, but because of this offshore drilling, this community has to move further inland, and so now we're kind of sounding the alarms for other people that are on the coast, and they're not just on the coast because they want to be there. They're on the coast because this is their way of life. This is how their community has functioned since time immemorial, and so that's the whole reason. Like, you know, I hear sometimes I get frustrated because, you know, I was in a restaurant here locally, and on the television there was a flash of like, okay, here's the current developments in Houston, and they're still trying to get back online, and I think, oh my God, you know, local people here look at that and say, oh my God, I'm so glad I don't live there. It's like, where do you think you live? How much of Boston existed here within, I don't know, like, the landfill situation? I mean, really, like, seriously, like, where do you think you live? See, you're not immune to this. But people live where they live because that's how they continue, that's how they exist, that's how they survive. And when we get into recovery situations, you know, I look at the situation with Maria, and, you know, there was, oh God, what was it, like whitefish or something like that? That, you know, just you know, there's this disaster capitalism that is that impacts. You know, you have a community that is desperately trying to get back to the way things were, and yet, you know, with this model of people saying, okay, now we're going to help, but we're really, you know, going to see how much we can get out of these people, or get out of the government to do these contracts. You know, what is the actual goal of recovery when we go down there and we do things to help people? So there is a bit of a latest madness that got me up in arms. Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke most recently released this proposal for the most expansive offshore drilling lease that could be. The whole, basically everywhere, except for Florida, because their beaches are so pretty. You know, they decided they would get exempt. But the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they'll be having a public meeting January 24th, which is Wednesday, at the Hyatt Regency from 3 to 7. So if you're opposed to offshore drilling, not just in Louisiana, and we're talking about even here. So if you're opposed to this, if you're opposed to coastal erosion, now is the time for you to get into those public meetings. Yes?
Excuse me, is that the airport Hyatt?
It was someone on Lafayette.
No, it's the one downtown.
Yeah.
It's a I signed up for it because I get a thing from the Conservation Law Foundation, and that's how I signed. Technically, you're supposed to sign for these things, but when you go to public meetings, they want people so bad, they will just sort of let you in. But if you want to sign up, it's through the Conservation Law Foundation. They are one of the people at least. And when I went through the nuclear, what to do with nuclear waste, everybody shows up in opposition, obviously, but they show up so that nobody caves into the government.
Right.
And they'll come from Maine, New Hampshire. The last time I went to one of these things, people came from huge distances just to be at that meeting and to oppose
Just to say no.
and to give
Just to say no.
testimony.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so that's another way that you can help here locally. And of course, you know, if you are so inclined to donate to the North American Indian Center of Boston, we would appreciate that as well. You know, so there's a lot of basis, and there's a lot to get, you know, upset about. Mad. I mean, I've gone through the whole thing. I mean, even the sort of the internal dysfunction that our tribes experience. I've had this sort of back and forth conversation with my own tribal government for the past 10 years. Organized my community mostly on stuff about like process and stuff like that. But you know, when in 2010, when this BP oil spill happened, that was the point where I was like, I had to go in general meeting. I was like, what are we going to do to help, you know, these state recognized tribes? I understand, you know, we're very active in USEC. We, you know, champion things like the legislative fix to Carcieri versus Salazar, which is a Supreme Court ruling which affects the ability of tribes to put land into trust and to start reclaiming their own indigenous territories. You know, we champion that, and there are other things, but you know, when it comes to ecology, when it comes to talking about how we as Indian people are going to get back to our roles of being stewards of the land, you know, that's something that we still need to have. And thankfully, within the last year, I was appointed to our Tribal Constitution Committee, and so we're looking to governments like the one in Bolivia, which constitutionally grant the right of nature to exist. Yes. So we are looking to reimagine our governing document. One thing that I've learned over the course of trying to do community organization within my tribe, trying to improve my tribal government, one thing that I've learned is that you cannot you might have little victories in the whole bit of like process and, you know, making sure that the government, you know, dots the I's and crosses the T's and all that stuff. But to really have effective change, you have to be empowered, and you have to tell people, look, this is where we are, great, but do you understand that 500 years ago, the first contact that we had with, you know, these people, our first recorded contact with De Soto was him going up to southeast Arkansas, and the chief of the time, the chief of the province that was held for our people, was elderly and came down from his house, you know, carrying a battle axe and says, you know, I'm gonna kill all of them, basically. You know, it was just that fire, you know, and having that context and knowing that we were so much more than a tribe. That, you know, we have our internal dynamics, we have factions or whatever, but you know, the land that we are on right now, which was whittled away systematically from us by the United States government. You know, now it's 150 acres, but the original Spanish land grant that my tribe got was a league square, which I asked that of a professor, and he was like, basically, you know, 2 in Louisiana's parishes, but 2 counties worth of land. Now it's like kind of whittled down to 150 acres, and you know, we kind of get lost in sort of like an impoverished mindset. We never can kind of like see outside of ourselves and imagine ourselves as something greater. But if we can do that, and there are tools, there are technologies. Here locally, I work with a nonprofit that emerged out of MIT Center for Bits and Atoms, and I help with fostering the growth of the International Fab Lab Network, which is a network of people using digital fabrication technology to make almost anything. And the first node within that network is right here in the South End, South End Technology Center, directed by Mel King. If you guys don't want to keep me too long, I can go to brunch. So they wait for me. It's been a couple of weeks, and it's a couple of weeks they start asking. So I got to get back to my surrogate grandparents there. But yeah, with digital tools like that, with the methodologies, the know-how, there are ways in which we can, you know, we can realize some of the visions that we have. But still, you have the internal dialogue between traditionalists versus non-traditionalists, and what are the ways that we can kind of reconcile? Like, here's what's available to us in the 21st century. Here's our traditional way of believing and doing things. You know, where are the medicine people? And you know, I would hope that through the merger of that and the ability to sort of like imagine a new world, we kind of become, you know, this new class of medicine people, of like, you know, bits and atoms, you know, using the digital technology, but then guided by spirit, and able to show the people, yes, this is the new model, and this is who we can be going forward. And that's only one solution, but you know, we're looking at so many more. We're looking for systemic change, and that's the bottom line for my people and for all of our people. Is that we have to get away from these prescribed models, Indian Reorganization Act constitutions that define our systems based upon the systems of the United States, which in turn, you know, of course, more perfect union, more perfect than who, or the Iroquois Confederacy and the Great Law of Peace. And so there's that lineage there. We're talking about, you know, it's Indian knowledge regardless, at the root of it. You know, we know how the world works because we see and we relate to the world as an ecosystem inherently, you know. Just one thing finally. I was at CoLang, which is the Institute for Collaborative Language Research, last year in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I had the opportunity to talk with one of the aunties from the Tlingit, and we were in a grant writing class, and she said, well, you know, I do have a proposal that I want to do. I want to go back to my old work, but my old work doesn't make sense anymore. And I said, well, what do you mean it doesn't make sense? She says, well, I went around and I recorded words from elders. And say, for instance, like I got the word for February